understand we have an opportunity before us to turn the page on the fear and the divisiveness.
And in my opinion, has a very low IQ. But we'll find out about her IQ during the debate, okay? Let's find out about her IQ.
November 5th will be historic. We're not just saying that. At the head of the campaign trail for the U.S. presidency, this was the first election between a former and sitting president in more than 60 years. We saw a historic first debate.
To do that, you have to be quite smart, and you have to be able to hit the ball a long way.
Look, I'd be happy to have a driving contest with him.
Followed by a historic dropout.
Joe Biden has just announced that he is dropping out of the 2024 presidential race.
And a historic replacement.
Kamala Harris has formally accepted her nomination as the Democratic candidate for president at her party's...
But even with clear historic milestones, American elections can be confusing. This particular election comes at a seemingly everlasting height of a multi-front war raging in the Middle East, an almost 3-year-old war between Russia and Ukraine, and worries at home, from recent natural disasters to economic woes. So, we're taking a look at what makes up an American presidential election, current events, and beyond. I'm Yasmin Altaji, and this is The Year of Elections, a podcast brought to you by the National's Opinion Desk. At an unlikely forefront of this year's election season,
in a state like Michigan, where there's like a large Arab American population.
A lot of Arab Americans say they feel alienated.
Especially now when the Arab American vote actually matters in an election.
Arab Americans. They make up an old and storied community with a deep, rich history in the U.S. From the mom-and-pop corner stores in Brooklyn or community centers in Chicago, to renowned academics like Edward Said, even politicians like Rashida Tlaib, today's Arab American community is as diverse as it is old, a tapestry of different threads, stories, histories, and political views.
So Arab Americans are not a monolith by any stretch.
Jihan Abdullah is a correspondent for The National based in D.C. She's telling us what we know, but what a country, one in the height of a contentious election season, can forget about any key demographic. It's not all black and white.
In the United States, I think when it comes to Muslim Americans, we're actually not talking about Arab Americans in very large numbers, as the majority of Muslim Americans, for instance, are South Asian. Whereas when we're talking about Arab Americans, they come from very many places, and a lot of them are actually also Christian. So that's important to add for some context. Arab Americans are also spread out in the country. But when it comes to this election, their presence in a few key places is going to be important.
The U.S. is home to nearly 3.7 million Arabs. So many that, after years of advocacy, the next U.S. Census will finally have a box to check for Middle Eastern and North African residents in the country. Arab and Middle Eastern culture is very much family and community-oriented. It's part of why members of the MENA community in the U.S. have, over decades and centuries, grouped into certain geographic areas, like Michigan. Michigan happens to be what's called a swing state. It's one of about a handful of states, usually the same ones, that tend to flip from red to blue or blue to red each election cycle. This year, those states are Michigan, Arizona, Georgia, Nevada, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. The way they vote could be pivotal in determining who wins the White House. Michiganders know that. They had voted for Joe Biden in 2020. He ended up winning Michigan by a hairline against Trump, just about 154,000 votes. This year, though, they wanted to make it clear they weren't so eager to mark ballots blue. That's why a group of Michigan's Arab Americans and their allies got together in February of this year during the Democratic primaries. They decided to mark their ballots uncommitted. And uncommitted got more than 100,000 votes and 2 Michigan delegates. It was considered a success, and the National Uncommitted Movement was born. A recent poll led by the DC-based Arab American Institute found that Donald Trump and Kamala Harris are virtually tied among Arab American voters. Here's the Institute's founder and president, James Zogby, who's also a columnist here at The National, on why that matters in a state like Michigan.
Arab American votes are classic swing votes in an election like this. If Trump is splitting the vote with her, that takes away 50, 60,000 votes that she'll need to win the state. Biden got almost 60%. She's down to 40%. The other thing is that we found that the numbers were soft in the sense that we ask a question, if she were to do this, demand a ceasefire or say she would suspend weapons if they don't comply with U.S. law, her numbers went up to almost 60%. That indicates a softness that she could do something to switch that vote. And the question is, will she have the wherewithal to do it?
The issue of U.S. handling of Israel's war in Gaza is a critical one, not just for Arab Americans, but especially for them. Here's our correspondent Jihan again.
Gaza. I've spoken to at least a dozen people who have lost over 100 relatives. And so this has impacted them really deeply.
It's part of why this election season, Arab Americans feel forced to choose between a candidate in Kamala Harris that struggles to make a break from the Biden administration's handling of the war in Gaza.
When we think about the threat that Hamas, Hezbollah presents, Iran, I think that it is, without any question, our imperative to do what we can to allow Israel to defend itself against those kinds of attacks.
And a candidate in Donald Trump, who uses and promotes rhetoric like this.
Israel's the one that wants to go. He said the only one who wants to keep going is Hamas. Actually, Israel is the one, and you should let him go and let him finish the job. He doesn't want to do it. He's become like a Palestinian, but they don't like him because he's a very bad Palestinian. He's a weak one.
Over the past year, I've been talking to Arab Americans in all of these places, and it really struck me how angry, but also how hurt this community has been in the Biden administration's handling of the war on Gaza, but more broadly of U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East.
So, what's a swing state? Why is Michigan so important? It has a little bit to do with this pendulum of red and blue popularity every 4 years, and a little bit to do with something called the Electoral College.
E-L-E-C-T-O-R-A-L Electoral College. We've got a tale to tell.
It's such a core concept of American elections and democracy, they try to teach them young.
And with how close the election is this year, at least in polls, in kind of the really key swing states, the Electoral College is absolutely on the minds of a lot of voters.
That's our Washington correspondent, Ellie Sennett. She's talking about one of the greatest blows to the Democratic Party in a presidential race, when Hillary Clinton secured the higher number of ballots in her name and won the popular vote, but lost the Electoral College, giving Trump his first term.
2016, with Donald Trump becoming one of the rare presidential wins who won the Electoral College in 2016 and lost the popular vote, and lost the popular vote by a big way, by almost 3 million votes. In modern American history, that has only happened, I believe, twice. And then I think 2 times, like back in the 19th century. So it's rare.
Donald Trump or Kamala Harris need 270 of the total 538 electoral votes in the country. Each state has a different number of electors, based on how much representation they have in Congress, which is in turn based on a state's population. The smaller your state's population, the more weight your vote could carry. So voters don't elect the president, they elect electors who elect the president.
Of your choice. You're also choosing state electors who will have the final voice. They're called
Let's look at what that ends up looking like in really populated and diverse states like California versus, a more white, kind of homogenous, less populated state like Wyoming. In California, what the Electoral College means for you as an individual voter is, your one vote is going to end up kind of dropping a pin. Your one vote, it kind of represents like 730,000 votes. In Wyoming, your voting power is far more concentrated. One vote kind of equals 192,000 votes in the Electoral College. So what that means, what that translates to, is that a Wyoming voter, the weight of their vote, it carries much heavier weight than the average Californian vote.
This year, the swing states we mentioned carry a total of more than 90 electoral votes. They can make a huge difference in the electoral outcome. That's why campaigns and voters pay so much attention to predictions about certain demographics, like Arab Americans in the case of this year's elections. We get these predictions through polls. Public opinion plays a really almost uniquely significant role in American elections. It helps candidates and researchers gauge what issues are on voters' minds, how voters are leaning, and what we can expect come Election Day. This year, some polls are telling us foreign policy has crept its way to the top of voters' priorities.
The answer with like what is the top issue for Americans, it's almost always it's the economy, stupid. But this year, foreign policy has kind of played a unique role, and particularly for Democrats, it's become a key issue for the Democratic Party, especially in part because of what we talked about with the razor-thin margins in some really important states.
Polls don't always get it right, though. We saw it happen in 2016 when Donald Trump beat Hillary Clinton, who was way ahead in the polls. Some of them, anyway. Different polls can have different answers to the same question depending on where you look. And each pollster has its own strengths and weaknesses. Some look at different communities, use different methods, outreach in different ways like phone calls, texts, and, in now rare cases, door-to-door canvassing. Naturally, they can all come up with different results. This is Robert Shapiro, a professor of political science at Columbia University who's been studying polling and polling methods in the U.S. for decades.
If you're trying to evaluate what the polls are saying, the best rule of thumb to give people, and this is very easy to deal with now, is not to rely on any one single poll, but to look at the averages.
With a key demographic and a key swing state at odds with both candidates, it's difficult to know what to expect. But a whole variety of polls are giving us some ideas. James Zorbi, whom we heard from earlier about the tie between Trump and Harris among Arab American voters, says specialized polling on key demographics is crucial.
I've never seen an election with Arab Americans where a foreign policy issue loomed so large and shaped everything that they were thinking.
His organization, the Arab American Institute, has led polls focusing on Arab Americans for about 30 years. Zorbi said that they usually find that Arab Americans are not unlike everybody else in the country.
Howard Dean, when he was running for president, came to me. We did an event in 2003, and all the candidates came. So he went away and came back in a minute, and he said, I figured it out. First, I'll talk about healthcare, Social Security, and Medicare, and education, and then I'll get into your issues. I said, no, Governor, actually, my people get sick, my people get old, my people want to be educated. Those are our issues. If you're talking about the war in Iraq, that's actually your issue. That's actually an issue that you can solve. Don't confuse things here. When we poll, we always get those issues are the top issues. It is niche polling, but when you run an organization that represents Arab Americans, you want to know where they are. And it can't be the five guys you had coffee with last night, who said the entire community feels this way. No, it's like, there has to be the second generation Maronite Lebanese immigrant living in Wichita and the more recent Iraqi American living in Dearborn, or the Palestinian grocer or Egyptian grocer in Brooklyn. They all count, right? And so polling is a way to get to that. And so, yeah, it's been informative for us, but also informative for the broader public in the country, especially now when the Arab American vote actually matters in an election.
AAI's latest poll, conducted with Zorbi Strategies, finds that 81% of Arab Americans view Gaza as important in determining their vote. When asked to rank their top issues, here's how Arab American voters answered. Jobs and the economy were first, with 39%, Gaza second, with 26%, and gun violence third, with 21%. For Arab American Democrats, Gaza ranked as the top issue overall. A different poll conducted by Delta Poll for The National examined more than 3,000 voters all over the U.S., including about half from swing states. It found that foreign policy issues were further down the list of top concerns. Only 3% of respondents in that poll listed the war in Gaza as one of the top 3 concerns facing them and their families. But when asked the broader question of how important the war in the Middle East is in determining their presidential pick, 71% said it was either very or fairly important, while 23% said it was not. 6% were unsure. There's an abundance of polling that surfaces when elections approach, and a media frenzy around it that Shapiro, the professor from Columbia we heard from earlier, says can actually shift public opinion in itself in this cycle of codependency. So what should people do?
Okay, well, in principle, I mean, people should vote based on their preferences and interests and so forth, and not be guided by the polls in any particular way. I think, though, if they should take note that if they live in a state where that's important and the race is close, their vote's going to be much more impactful, so to speak, than if the race weren't close. And that should really, in theory, give them an incentive to vote. There actually been a couple quirky cases in the United States for local offices where candidates have won by one vote. So I mean, there is always that lingering possibility.
So how will Arab Americans be voting? We'll only really know after Election Day. Some are leaning toward third-party candidates like Jill Stein and Cornel West.
Civil liberties who are standing up for our right to protest this genocide that is being committed in our name with our tax dollars against the will of the American people who by a
Here's Jihan.
A significant number of Arab Americans have now rallied around third-party candidate, with, in this case, mostly Jill Stein, but also Cornel West, who have expressed clearer views when it comes to the Middle East by saying that the U.S. needs to reverse course in its support for Israel, and it needs to at least consider an arms embargo on Israel over its handling of the war. We have Arab Americans saying that, okay, we know that a third-party candidate is not going to win.
You know what? If you want Donald Trump to win, then say that, otherwise I'm speaking.
But we cannot, in good conscience, vote for either candidate. And so we still have a vote. We're not going to stay home. And the only way to make our voice heard is to vote for a third-party candidate.
Zoghbi from the Arab American Institute says others are leaning toward Trump for reasons having and not having to do with the war.
They were either voting for Trump as a way to punish Democrats for Gaza. This election is interesting because it's so deeply frustrating because we're finding the Trump people are courting Arab Americans sometimes for the wrong reason. They're trying to get them to dividing the community on certain cultural values issues, dividing the community on picking the Lebanese and ignoring the other component groups in the community.
Those unimpressed with both parties will just stay home.
I'm not convinced that 40+% of Arab Americans or 40+% of Muslims who are mostly non-Arab.
Some are voting Democrat, if only just to keep Trump out of office.
Or they were voting for Harris because they thought she might be better in the end.
Whichever way they turn, these votes still reflect at least some degree of a desire by Arab Americans to break away from the status quo. Maybe they will. Thanks for listening. You can follow and subscribe to The Year of Elections on all streaming platforms to get the latest episodes as soon as they come out. Our podcast editor is Doa Farid. Our audio engineer is Arthur Edison. I'm your host and producer for this episode, Yasmin Altaji.